December 1944. The snow along the Ardennes forest lay silent, except for the shuffle of boots and the rattle of empty canteens. A column of captured German soldiers trudged through the cold, their gray uniforms faded, their faces hollowed by hunger. For weeks, they had fought without bread, without warmth, without hope. At the edge of a clearing stood an American camp, rows of olive-green tents, smoke curling from field kitchens. The air smelled of something unreal to the prisoners: roasted meat, coffee, and fresh bread. Steam rose from metal pots as U.S. cooks stirred thick stew, ladling it into tin trays for their own men and for the prisoners behind them. The Germans hesitated, staring in disbelief. They had been told Americans were savages, men who tortured, who starved captives. Yet here, their enemy handed them food warmer and richer than anything they had received from their own officers in months. A young corporal whispered to another, almost trembling, "Wir kämpfen gegen die falschen Männer." We've been fighting the wrong men. That moment of silence between enemy and captor marked the beginning of a deeper shock, one that no weapon could deliver. By late 1944, the war that Germany had unleashed across Europe was collapsing in on itself. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht, which had marched with precision across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, was now a starving, exhausted army retreating through ruined cities and frozen fields. The promise of Hitler's thousand-year Reich had turned into a landscape of rubble and smoke. In the West, Allied bombers had shattered the industrial heart of Germany. Railways were broken, supply depots obliterated, and food convoys burned before they ever reached the front. Civilians scavenged for potatoes in frozen ground. Soldiers boiled tree bark for soup. Even senior officers often went without proper rations. The myth of German efficiency was breaking under the weight of total war. Meanwhile, across the lines, the United States Army was moving through Europe with an unmatched logistical machine, a system that could feed millions of men across oceans and continents. But on the German side, things were very different. The once proud divisions that had crossed into France 4 years earlier were now shadows of their former selves. Many units had no fuel, no winter uniforms, and little to eat except hard bread or whatever they could find in abandoned farms. Letters from the front tell a grim story. A soldier from the 332nd Infantry Division wrote home in November 1944, "We have no meat, no sugar, and no bread for days. The horses die in the cold. We are next." Even in Hitler's inner circle, whispers of collapse spread. The High Command's obsession with punishment and loyalty had replaced reason. Desertion or complaints about rations could lead to execution. On the battlefield, hungry men fought without conviction. Some surrendered not out of cowardice, but because surrender meant survival. When captured, they expected the worst: starvation, humiliation, perhaps death. The Nazi propaganda machine had told them that Allied troops, especially Americans, were brutal monsters who would kill without mercy. But what awaited them was something entirely unexpected. Across Europe, temporary American POW camps were being set up behind the front lines, orderly, efficient, and surprisingly humane. The U.S. military, bound by the Geneva Convention and its own moral code, believed that even prisoners deserved dignity. Rations, medical care, and shelter were to be provided, no matter how fierce the battle had been. Yet for many German soldiers, this concept was almost incomprehensible. They came from a system built on fear, hierarchy, and scarcity, where officers dined separately and the lower ranks starved. To them, being offered warm food by an enemy was not just kindness. It was a psychological shock. That shock would deepen in the weeks to come, when German prisoners discovered that the Americans not only treated them fairly, but often fed them better than their own commanders ever had. It was a contrast born not of pity, but of power, the quiet power of abundance, discipline, and humanity. And as more German divisions collapsed, tens of thousands of soldiers found themselves marching not toward death, but toward a kind of truth they had never imagined. On the other side of the lines, the United States had mastered a form of warfare that went far beyond the battlefield, a war of logistics, supply, and organization. While the German army struggled to feed its troops, the U.S. military had created an unprecedented system that could deliver everything from ammunition to apple pie thousands of miles from home. This system was known as the Red Ball Express, an immense convoy operation that ran day and night. After the D-Day landings in 1944, thousands of trucks roared across liberated France, carrying fuel, rations, spare parts, and medical supplies. Every soldier on the front, from Normandy to the Ardennes, could expect hot meals, fresh uniforms, and cigarettes, the small comforts that kept morale alive in the face of chaos. Behind this supply network stood the quiet genius of American industry. In a single month, U.S. factories could produce more food than the entire German army could consume in a year. From canned meat and fruit to chocolate bars and coffee, these rations were carefully packed and distributed to ensure that every soldier and every prisoner would eat. To many Germans, the sheer scale of this abundance was unimaginable. In the Reich, food was rationed to the bone. Soldiers were expected to endure hunger as a badge of honor. American soldiers, on the other hand, were encouraged to eat well, to stay strong, to remain human in the inhumanity of war. The difference was not just material, it was moral. The Americans fought to liberate, not to enslave. They saw the enemy not as subhuman, but as defeated men bound by a cause they could not sustain. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally emphasized adherence to the Geneva Convention. "We fight by the rules," he declared, "because we are the kind of people who make rules worth fighting for." By late 1944, with the German army crumbling, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were being processed in makeshift camps across France, Belgium, and later, within the United States itself. These camps were organized, disciplined, and astonishingly well supplied. Prisoners received medical attention, Red Cross parcels, and food prepared by U.S. Army cooks. For many of these men, especially the younger ones who had been raised under years of Nazi indoctrination, the first warm meal in captivity was a revelation. Meat stew with vegetables, bread thick with butter, real coffee instead of acorn substitutes. Some wept as they ate. Others refused at first, suspecting it was a trick. But day after day, the pattern continued. The Americans treated their captives with a strange combination of efficiency and compassion. There was no cruelty, no revenge. The war might have stripped them of uniforms and weapons, but not of dignity. German officers, on the other hand, often reacted with bitterness. They saw their men being fed and cared for by the enemy and felt their authority slipping away. Some demanded that their soldiers refuse the food. Few obeyed. Hunger was stronger than pride. And so, across Europe and later in camps across the Atlantic, thousands of German prisoners began to experience something they had never known under their own flag: equality. They would remember it for the rest of their lives. For most German soldiers, surrender was not a choice made lightly. They had been raised in a military culture that glorified obedience and despised weakness. But by the winter of 1944, hunger had become stronger than ideology. The body had limits, and many had reached theirs. In those final months, rations at the front had collapsed. Soldiers went days without meat or bread, surviving on thin soup made from whatever roots or scraps could be found. Some stole from civilians. Others traded medals or watches for a handful of food. Even officers began to suffer. One captured lieutenant later admitted, "I knew the war was lost when I watched my men fight over a frozen potato." When these men fell into American hands, they were prepared for humiliation, for the kind of cruelty they had seen in the East. But instead of fists, they met food. Instead of mockery, they met order. For the first time in months, they were told to stand in line, not to be punished, but to receive something simple and unimaginable: a meal. The American cooks did not speak their language, yet the sound of ladles scraping against metal pots said more than words ever could. To the prisoners, that stew, thick with beans, meat, and vegetables, symbolized something beyond sustenance. It was civilization itself, reintroduced to men who had been stripped of it by war. Some cried silently as they ate, ashamed of the weakness that had driven them to tears. But others, in that moment, felt the smallest spark of humanity return. They had been taught that the enemy was barbaric, yet here they were, being fed by him. To the Americans, feeding the enemy wasn't an act of kindness, it was duty. The United States Army ran on rules, and those rules came from both law and conscience. Every soldier was taught the Geneva Convention. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely, provided shelter, clothing, and food equivalent to that of the captor's own troops. Eisenhower and his officers understood something deeper, that cruelty weakened morale, while order strengthened it. "A disciplined army doesn't need hate to win," one commander remarked. "It needs reason." The American field kitchens became quiet symbols of that discipline. They were run like clockwork, even under fire. Men worked in shifts to prepare rations for thousands, ensuring that no prisoner went hungry. Each POW received the same basic rations as U.S. troops, often better than what the average German soldier had eaten during the last year of the war. This wasn't generosity, it was confidence. The Americans could afford to feed their enemy because they were winning. They could show mercy without fear of weakness. Among the cooks, guards, and medics, there was a sense of pride that they represented something greater than revenge. Some were farm boys from Kansas or mechanics from Chicago. They didn't hate the Germans, they just wanted the war to end. And if feeding prisoners helped do that faster, so be it. A U.S. sergeant stationed near Cherbourg later said, "You can't fight men forever. Feed them, and they'll stop being soldiers. They'll start being people again." While individual soldiers followed orders with quiet decency, the decision to treat German POWs well came from the very top. Eisenhower, Marshall, and other Allied leaders believed that how the United States handled its prisoners would shape the post-war world. They had seen what happened when hatred ruled policy, the atrocities in Eastern Europe, the starvation of Soviet prisoners in German camps, the endless spiral of vengeance. America was determined not to follow that path. Eisenhower issued strict guidelines to every division. Prisoners were to be processed quickly, given proper medical attention, and provided rations equivalent to U.S. soldiers in the field. Any mistreatment was to be punished. "Our strength," he said, "lies in the contrast between our conduct and that of the enemy." These policies had a psychological purpose, too. By showing fairness and abundance, the U.S. hoped to break the enemy's spirit not through force, but through realization. A German soldier who ate better in captivity than he had under the Reich could not help but question everything he'd been told. And indeed, many did. Reports began reaching Allied intelligence that German POWs were openly criticizing Hitler, doubting propaganda, and even volunteering for post-war reconstruction projects. The decision to feed them well had done more than fill stomachs. It had begun to undermine the ideological core of the Nazi regime itself. As one captured officer wrote in his diary months later, "They did not defeat us with bombs or tanks. They defeated us with decency." That quiet moral power would soon ripple beyond the camps and into the minds of those who once believed they were fighting for a superior civilization. For years, the Nazi regime had built its soldiers on lies, that Americans were weak, corrupt, racially impure, and driven by greed. In German propaganda films and leaflets, U.S. soldiers were shown as cowards who relied only on machines. Prisoners expected torture, humiliation, or starvation. But when they entered American captivity, what they saw instead shattered that belief system entirely. The first meal did more than satisfy hunger. It dismantled ideology. The prisoners could not reconcile the image of barbaric Americans with the reality before them. Clean uniforms, orderly camps, and warm food shared without hatred. The shock was moral as much as physical. It was proof that everything they had been told might have been a lie. For many, that realization came with unbearable guilt. They thought of the civilians their army had starved in occupied Europe, of Soviet prisoners who had died by the millions behind German wire, and now their own captors, the supposed monsters, offered them life. One former prisoner later recalled, "We were confused, ashamed. We thought of what our soldiers had done to others, and now we were being treated like human beings." It was more painful than punishment. The American meal became a silent moral weapon, one that struck deeper than artillery ever could. It revealed the humanity of the enemy and the inhumanity of their own cause. Inside U.S. POW camps, German soldiers found themselves in a microcosm of a world they had never known. Guards of different races worked side by side. Black American troops supervised German officers. Jewish cooks prepared meals for Nazi soldiers. And yet, the system worked. Calm, professional, without hatred. For men raised under a regime obsessed with racial purity. This was almost impossible to comprehend. One German NCO at Camp Butner in North Carolina later admitted, "The greatest humiliation was not defeat, but to see a Negro soldier in charge of us, and to realize he behaved better than many of our own." That cultural shock ran deep. It wasn't just that America was stronger, it was freer. The prisoners saw newspapers, radios, books, and even churches inside the camps. They were allowed to sing, play soccer, write letters. Some joined orchestras or theater groups. In one camp, a group of former Nazi youth members staged a play about freedom and forgiveness, under the supervision of an American officer who encouraged them to think for themselves. These experiences began to change minds in ways bullets never could. Even food reflected this contrast. American rations included fruits, vegetables, and sweets, symbols of comfort and equality. Everyone, regardless of rank, received the same meal. There were no special tables for officers, no separation of privilege. To men who had lived under a rigid hierarchy where power meant more food, that equality was both humiliating and enlightening. For the first time, they saw a system where respect was earned, not enforced. The U.S. Army may not have planned it consciously, but its humane treatment of prisoners became a form of psychological warfare, one of the most effective of the entire war. While the Nazis ruled through fear, the Americans ruled through consistency and fairness. Prisoners soon realized that cooperation, not resistance, earned trust, and trust brought small freedom. They were allowed to work, to study, even to earn small wages. The more they integrated into camp life, the more their hostility faded. American intelligence officers noticed this shift and began using it strategically. Camps held discussion programs, film screenings, and reading circles designed to expose German soldiers to democratic values. It was subtle, non-violent re-education, and it worked. By 1945, reports from multiple POW camps showed a dramatic decline in Nazi loyalty. Soldiers who once shouted slogans now talked about rebuilding Germany on moral, not military, strength. Many later became part of West Germany's reconstruction, guided by the same democratic ideals they had first encountered as prisoners. The power of that transformation lay not in propaganda, but in simple human acts. A meal, a gesture, a rule obeyed without cruelty. A German prisoner at Camp Swift once told a guard, "You don't know what you've done. You've fed us better than our own army did. You've shown us why we lost." That single sentence captured what the entire war of ideology had come down to. Not just weapons, but values. The Americans had won not only the military campaign, they had won the moral one. And that victory was unfolding quietly, across fences lined with barbed wire, as the prisoners of a fallen empire learned what civilization really meant. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end, and the scale of German surrender was beyond anything seen before. From the ruins of the Ruhr to the fields of Bavaria, whole divisions laid down their arms. The Allies were overwhelmed by prisoners. Within weeks, nearly 3 million German soldiers were in American hands. What followed was one of the most remarkable scenes of the entire war. An army of defeated men being fed by their enemies. Temporary holding camps, called Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow camps, sprang up across western Germany. Rows of barbed wire stretched over muddy plains, hastily organized to contain tens of thousands of prisoners. Conditions varied, but the U.S. Army, stretched thin by victory, still tried to maintain order and dignity where possible. Field kitchens worked non-stop. Trucks arrived with crates of rations stamped U.S. Army, property of the War Department. The smell of hot stew and bread drifted through the air, carried over men who had forgotten what warmth smelled like. At Camp Remagen, witnesses recalled how German soldiers, some barely 18, broke down as American cooks served them food without insult. An American corporal named Jack L. Myers later said, "They looked like ghosts. We fed them, and they just stood there, not knowing whether to eat or salute." In other camps, captured officers grew angry. They accused the Americans of spoiling their men. One colonel reportedly demanded that rations for enlisted prisoners be reduced, arguing that they should not live better as captives than they did as soldiers. The American response was quiet and firm. All prisoners received the same standard meal. The U.S. kitchen crews followed procedure: meat stew, bread, coffee, fruit, and sometimes chocolate. It wasn't luxury, it was regulation. But to the Germans, it felt like abundance beyond imagination. At Camp Swift in Texas, where thousands of POWs were later transported across the Atlantic, the surprise deepened. When German prisoners arrived after their long voyage, they were greeted by rows of barracks, clean clothes, and organized meals. The first dinner they received was beef stew, potatoes, and pudding. Many could not eat at first, convinced it was a trick. Then one man tasted it, began to cry, and others followed. Letters from those camps began to circulate secretly among prisoners, written in careful handwriting and smuggled home through Red Cross mail. One said simply, "The Americans treat us as men. They feed us as they feed their own." Such reports spread through captured ranks like wildfire. The image of America, once painted as corrupt and weak, was replaced by one of overwhelming strength wrapped in decency. The effect was profound. German morale didn't just collapse on the battlefield. It dissolved inside the minds of those who realized their captors had defeated them in every way, militarily, materially, and morally. The Americans could have chosen revenge. Instead, they chose rules, efficiency, and order. The quiet dignity of a civilization that believed power meant responsibility. And as one German officer later wrote from captivity, "We thought we were the masters of Europe. Then we were fed by the people we called inferior." That was the day Germany truly lost the war. By the time Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, the psychological transformation among its captured soldiers was unmistakable. The war had ended, but for hundreds of thousands of German POWs held by the Americans, something even deeper was unfolding. The slow, dawning realization that they had been fighting for a lie. The turning point didn't come through lectures or interrogations. It came through ordinary things: meals, discipline, fairness. At Camp Butner, North Carolina, German officers accustomed to strict rank hierarchy were shocked to find that enlisted men ate the same food they did. When they tried to reimpose class separation, the American camp commander refused. "Here," he told them through an interpreter, "you are all soldiers, not rulers and servants." It was a concept alien to them, yet deeply unsettling. Over time, it began to reshape the very sense of who they were. Some POWs volunteered to help in American farms and factories. They worked beside civilians, were paid small wages, and ate lunch shoulder to shoulder with Americans. There was no hatred in these fields, only routine, and through routine, perspective. They saw ordinary Americans living freely, unafraid of police or propaganda. They saw churches full, children playing, and food everywhere. To men raised under fear, this calm abundance was revolutionary. Letters began leaving the camps, carried through the Red Cross. They told of respect, decency, and food, always food. Many of these letters survive, and their words still echo the quiet astonishment of those who wrote them. The guards give us coffee every morning. They eat with us. They joke with us. They live better than our generals, and yet they are humble. One particularly striking letter from a former Luftwaffe pilot described how an American officer shared his Christmas meal with German prisoners in 1945. "He gave us turkey and pie," the pilot wrote. "He said, 'Merry Christmas.' We sat in silence. None of us could speak. It was the strangest defeat I have ever felt. That defeat was not humiliation, it was revelation." As the months passed, even hardened Nazis began to crumble under the weight of reality. Their faith in Hitler's words evaporated, replaced by the undeniable evidence of a society built on abundance, fairness, and law. The U.S. command recognized this shift. Quietly, they encouraged it. POWs were given access to reading material, newspapers, and lectures about democracy and human rights. The goal was not revenge, it was renewal. Eisenhower called it re-education through reality, and it worked. When many of these prisoners finally returned to Germany in 1946 and 1947, they carried with them more than stories of defeat. They carried seeds of an idea that dignity, not domination, made a nation strong. Some of them would later join the rebuilding of Germany's new democratic institutions. Others would raise children who saw America not as an enemy, but as a model. The shock that began with a single bowl of American stew had turned into a quiet revolution of thought. It was the moment the war for hearts and minds was won, not by speeches, but by supper. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the world stood in ruins, cities flattened, economies shattered, and millions displaced. But amid the devastation, a quieter story was taking root inside the barbed wire fences of American POW camps. For thousands of German soldiers, captivity under the Americans had become the first real contact with the values that would later rebuild their country. By mid-1945, the United States held nearly 3.8 million German prisoners of war across Europe and North America. Some were still in temporary field enclosures along the Rhine, but hundreds of thousands had already been transported across the Atlantic to camps scattered across the American heartland, Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, Illinois, and beyond. There, behind wooden fences and watchtowers, life began to resemble something astonishingly normal. POWs were issued clean uniforms marked with PW, given proper beds, and served 3 meals a day. They worked on farms, in sawmills, and in factories, always under supervision, but often with surprising freedom. American farmers who had lost sons to the war now found themselves working alongside the very men who had once worn the enemy's uniform. Yet mutual respect began to grow. One farmer in Iowa recalled, "They were polite, hard-working, and grateful. At first, I couldn't stand the idea of them being here. But after a few weeks, I realized they were just boys, hungry and tired. I shared lunch with them every day." The same story repeated across the country. Local children would bring candy or newspapers to the camps. German POWs, skilled craftsmen and engineers, repaired machinery, painted barns, and even built community structures. The food they received, meat, bread, vegetables, milk, and sometimes dessert, astonished them daily. Reports from the U.S. Army noted how the average German prisoner gained weight during captivity. Medical officers described improvements in health and morale. Many had entered the camps malnourished, their faces hollow from the front. Months later, they were healthier than they had been since the start of the war. But the transformation was not merely physical. Inside these camps, many began to reflect deeply on what had gone wrong in Germany. They read books on democracy, religion, and philosophy. Some were given English classes. In one camp in Kansas, POWs held open debates about guilt, ideology, and humanity. Discussions that would have been unthinkable under the Gestapo's shadow. The American command quietly encouraged this introspection. They saw education and fairness as tools of reconstruction, weapons far more powerful than rifles. As General Lucius Clay later said, "We had to show them what freedom looked like, not tell them." For the prisoners, that freedom began with something as simple as breakfast. It was food without fear, a concept Germany had forgotten. And when the time came for repatriation, many German POWs left American soil with gratitude rather than resentment. In their letters home, they wrote of kindness and respect, of how they had learned that real strength did not require cruelty. One of them, former Sergeant Karl Aderhold, wrote in 1946, "The Americans treated us not as beasts, but as men. They fed us, clothed us, and let us think. We came here as soldiers. We return as human beings." Those words would echo through a shattered Germany, quietly influencing the moral foundations of the nation that would soon rise again from its ruins. As the months turned into years, the war's physical wounds began to heal, but the moral consequences of how America treated its prisoners endured far longer. What began as a logistical necessity evolved into one of the most successful examples of psychological and cultural transformation in modern history. When German POWs returned home between 1946 and 1948, they came back not as broken captives, but as men who had seen a different world. They spoke of fair treatment, of shared meals, of guards who smiled instead of screamed. Their stories spread across a devastated nation still reeling from defeat and shame. For many civilians, these testimonies sounded impossible. They had been told that Americans would enslave or execute German prisoners. Instead, their sons came home praising the humanity of their captors. The contrast shook what remained of Nazi mythology. It revealed to the German people that cruelty had been a choice, and that decency had always been an alternative. The U.S. War Department recognized this soft power long before the prisoners went home. American officers documented the transformation, noting that well-treated POWs became cooperative, productive, and emotionally stable. Many even volunteered to assist Allied administrators in the occupation zone, helping to restore infrastructure and maintain order. Eisenhower's moral strategy had worked, not by humiliating the defeated, but by integrating them into a framework of fairness. By feeding them, the Americans had done more than prevent rebellion. They had earned credibility. Historians later called it the human victory. It was the triumph of principle over hatred, and it shaped the moral architecture of the post-war West. When West Germany emerged as a democratic state in 1949, many of its early advocates for reform had once been POWs in the United States. They remembered the discipline, the rules, and the decency. One of them, theologian Helmut Thielicke, summarized it simply: "We had been conquered by strength, but redeemed by fairness."
That fairness left a legacy beyond Germany. Around the world, stories of American POW camps became part of a larger narrative that freedom and dignity were stronger than fear and revenge. Even the Soviet Union, notorious for its brutal treatment of German prisoners, quietly studied U.S. policies with a mix of envy and denial. The difference was unmistakable. In Soviet captivity, millions perished. In American camps, most lived, and many left better fed and healthier than when they had been captured. The contrast became a propaganda weapon of its own, proving to the world that American ideals could stand even under the weight of total war. And back home, American citizens, many of whom had lost family in the fighting, learned something too. They saw their government choose humanity over hatred, order over chaos. Newspapers wrote proudly about our POW camps, emphasizing that America's strength lay not only in its firepower, but in its conscience. As the last ships carrying German prisoners departed U.S. ports, the guards who had watched over them often waved goodbye. Some even exchanged letters that continued for years. There were friendships, apologies, and invitations to visit. One former guard from Texas wrote decades later, "We didn't think feeding them would change anything, but it did. We fed them, and they went home believing in something better." In that quiet truth lay the final victory of the United States in World War II, the power to rebuild enemies into future allies, not with fear, but with food, fairness, and respect. In every war, there are two kinds of victories. The first is measured in weapons, numbers, and flags raised over ruins. The second, quieter and deeper, is measured in the way a nation behaves when the killing stops. For the United States, the feeding of German prisoners became that second kind of victory. It was not planned as a moral lesson, yet it became one. Across muddy camps and across oceans, the defeated tasted the strength of a people who believed that discipline did not require cruelty, and that humanity was not weakness but power. Those meals, served under canvas tents and guarded fences, were more than rations. They were a declaration that civilization endures even when the world burns. Each bowl of stew, each loaf of bread, carried a message louder than any speech. We do not become our enemies to defeat them. The German soldiers who experienced that truth never forgot it. Many returned home and helped build a new Germany that looked west, not east. A Germany that understood democracy not through propaganda, but through memory. The memory of being treated as men when they least deserved it. Historians still debate the scale of that moral impact, but the human evidence is undeniable. The letters, the testimonies, the lifelong gratitude all point to a quiet revolution that began not in the rubble of Berlin, but in the order of American camps. It proved that mercy can be strategic, that empathy can rebuild faster than fear, and that in the ashes of total war, feeding the defeated could feed something greater, the idea that decency, even in victory, is what separates nations that conquer from nations that lead. In the end, The Americans didn't just win the war with tanks and bombers, they won it with kitchens and coffee pots, with structure and self-control, with the belief that real power doesn't shout, it serves. And somewhere, decades later, an old German veteran sitting in a quiet kitchen still remembers the smell of that first American meal, and the day he realized that the enemy had fed him not only food, but truth.